Good afternoon. I'm Jon Lentz with City and State, and I'm pleased to welcome everyone to today's discussion, Establishing a Successful Cannabis Marketplace, Best Practices for a Collaborative Approach. There's been a flurry of developments in New York State as New York takes steps to implement a law legalizing cannabis in New York. Regulated sales are expected before the end of the year. Many operators and entrepreneurs are looking to get into the industry here in New York. The state announced that the first retail licenses will go to people convicted of a marijuana-related offense or who have family members who were, to benefit communities harmed by the war on drugs. Meanwhile, Native American tribes have already started selling marijuana, raising questions about how regulations will or won't affect them. And state lawmakers are looking to let marijuana businesses take state tax deductions that are available to other industries. That's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot to cover here. Before we get into it, I'll note that we do have a Q&A function. As time permits, we may take one or two questions at the end of the discussion. However, there's a lot of ground to cover. We may not get to audience questions, but feel free to add those in case we do have time. There's also a chat function where you can share your thoughts. You can change the settings so you send that to the full group, all audience members and panelists as well, so everyone can see what you want to share. Finally, let's get to the discussion. We'll hear from several experts sharing their insights about what's underway in New York and their input on how to make it all work. I'll now turn it over to our moderator, Emily Whalen, who's a cannabis practice lead and attorney at Brown and Weinraub. Emily, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan, and welcome everyone to our panel. It's a pretty exciting topic. As Jonathan alluded to, there's a lot going on, and we're almost at the 1-year anniversary of New York's passage of Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. So it feels like a really good time to start this conversation and hear from some folks who have been involved in the industry in a few different ways. Today, we will have someone from the medical cannabis industry, someone who's an out-of-state licensee, and someone who is involved in track and trace of cannabis. And I'm excited to welcome everyone. So I will turn it over first for introductions and start with Ngiste, if you could introduce yourself.
Happily. Thank you, Emily. And thank you to City and State for hosting this and to the sponsors who made today's event possible. My name is Ngiste Abebe, and I am the Vice President of Public Policy at Columbia Care. I also serve as the President of the New York Medical Cannabis Industry Association, and am actually a cannabis regulator as an appointee to the Public Health Advisory Council in Virginia. So looking forward to today's discussion.
Vince, could you go next?
Sure. Thanks, Emily. My name is Ning. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of Nabis. We are a licensed distributor and wholesale marketplace platform based out in California. We've grown to become the largest player supporting thousands of businesses, both on the retail and brand side of things, and looking at seeing ways we can help out the New York market from supporting local operators. Really excited to be here.
And I'll close it out. I'm David Urbanowicz from Metrc. I lead government affairs and new business development. And a little bit about Metrc. We're the leading provider of track and trace solutions in the United States.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. So as Jonathan mentioned, there were some recent announcements from the Office of Cannabis Management here in New York, namely the announcement of the regulations for individuals who are looking to apply for a conditional adult use dispensary license. So I thought we'd jump right in, no hard topics, and start the conversation talking about social equity, which could be a webinar of its own in this space, and something that for me was the major tenet of the MRTA. A huge kudos to the legislators who pushed so hard for that, and for the state and the executive for talking it through too and making it into a program that is really robust here in New York. I don't know how to ask the best question for this, right? But I'm interested in what all of you think about New York social equity goals. What have you seen in the other states where you're working? What are you excited about? What are you nervous about? What do you have to say about social equity?
So I'm happy to jump in and take a first stab at this. I think it's kind of interesting, right? So social equity is kind of a microcosm of what we're seeing with state policy, which is that everyone likes to do it a little bit differently. They all like to put their own spin on it, which I personally find pretty fascinating, right? Because it creates these little natural experiments of different models of how to roll out a new marketplace, or a newly legal marketplace, I should say. And I think social equity is no different, right? Every single state is trying to do it differently. Some aren't trying at all, candidly. And I think the benefit here as well is that states can start to learn from each other, right? So you can look at, Colorado, for instance, which didn't really have any focus on social equity from the outset, and now has an accelerator program, right? Virginia, kind of interestingly, they wanted to get it right from the outset. Now they're revisiting it a little bit now that there's a change in control in the legislature. Illinois also trying to get it right, is trying to get it right from the outset. I think they've got some interesting ideas, to qualify. It's not just your ethnicity or your experience, but it's also potentially where you reside. So there's kind of a geographic tie. I think what I'm really excited about New York is there's kind of two key pillars to it, right? It's not just getting access to the capital and access to the licenses, but it's also training. And I think that's a big piece that states have often overlooked. It's not just having the funding to go through the application process, to set up your business, et cetera. It's also having the know-how to navigate these government policies, these procedures, to actually fill out a good application, or to navigate the permitting process, or even to deal with and be compliant on an ongoing basis once you have the business set up. So I would say training is a critical aspect. I think New York is trying to approach that in the right way. I think ultimately, one of the biggest question marks in my mind is how well are these programs running? And I think that's probably the biggest opportunity is, how can we start to evaluate, right? What data can we start to pull that shows, are these programs successful in allowing social equity licensees to prosper?
Yeah, I think, David, that's like the real key part that we're all waiting for. And I think one of the things to acknowledge is, I think MCBA, the Minority Cannabis Business Association, recently put out a report, and I think there are 13 states that have some type of social equity program. Only 6 of those, I think, have actually started even implementing those programs. And so we're still very early out from understanding like the intent that was written into law, the regulations that are done, and the folks who are able to participate. Are we actually going to be able to achieve those? And I think there are 2 things that New York is doing really well right now. One is by issuing 100, the anticipation is some unknown number, but roughly at least 100, I think, is the number we all keep hearing. That we're going to be issuing something, and quickly, which is good for everyone, because we all know cannabis is already in New York, and the whole goal is to get this into a safe, regulated, and tax structure and tested product structure. So it's quickly moving folks in that direction, bringing this online. But it's also not issuing all of the licenses at once. So if it turns out that there needs to be changes to these definitions, changes to the programming, changes to ensure that the MRTA intent is actually being realized, there's still plenty of licenses left to keep building out and improving the equity program to ensure we can get those goals right. I think that there is a lot to be done in a very short period of time. And what we typically find when it comes to equity is a lot of time equity programs don't necessarily fail on the intent or the well-meaning behind it. They end up getting picked apart because of different issues in implementation, whether it's the fact that we can't do race-based criteria because of due process or 14th Amendment and equal protection clause concerns without enough data, or the fact that lots of people were impacted and different definitions might mean different folks are able to participate or not participate, as the case may be. So I think there's a lot that's very promising, but the most important thing is we're finally moving on actually issuing these licenses and having a sense of who's going to be able to apply and being able to invest and get folks ready to open up these businesses.
Yeah. Vince, I know you're in California, right? So you've seen this, and you've seen a social equity construct out there that I know is a little bit different, more municipality based than state based. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Urban and Ngiste basically covered a lot of what I see as an operator in the space out in California. The intent is there. I don't think that's in question. I think it's mostly the implementation and also the sustainability of it. And so out in California, just to provide some of my, our personal experience. When we first started this business about 4 years ago, California was changing from the medical market to the recreational market. Basically, it was opening up similar to the time New York is at today at this stage. And, California has more of a municipality-based system where the state is a very thin layer of licensing approvals and application process requirements. And they kind of delegate most of the heavy lifting from an application requirements perspective to the municipalities. And so then to Urban's point, each municipality in California had its own style of how they wanted to support social equity. Some didn't have any. I would say the vast majority of municipalities do have, some way of supporting social equity that guarantees that, that social equity applicants have, financial upside in the industry. But at the end of the day, we, for instance, we're based in Oakland. We basically we're a general applicant and help support a social equity applicant. And so our licenses were actually tied together. And so their success meant our success. And that was an interesting way to align interests. And so what we did was we contributed financially and helped support their business, both financially, but also operationally. They were a complementary business to ours. We do distribution, they do retail. So we provided them with the best products at the lowest prices. They were ultimately able to help succeed. And we kind of, left them on their way. We helped them when they were, also attacked during the civil unrest situation and helped them do a fundraiser. But at the end of the day, I think there's a lot of businesses who will take advantage of the system too and try to find workarounds and loopholes to get their license applications through. But at the end of the day, don't leave the social equity business in a good place after the initial requirement is taken care of. So I think New York has a real opportunity, given, first of all, these licenses are going to be more scrutinized at the state level. And there's a more of a blanket, a more universal social equity definition that the state level has to be able to control what that means and, be able to adjust and evolve it as they learn. And I think as an operator, it makes it, a lot easier as well to not have to manage different social equity applications on a per municipality level, and various requirements to that. So, I'm excited for what New York has to offer. And I guess the last piece is also around the $200 million social equity fund for retail. That's something that, at least to my knowledge, is the first I've seen that a state's done to help support social equity businesses in such a major way. And I think that level of sustainable financial support for operators on the social equity side is going to be really critical to their long-term success.
Thanks.
Illinois has a grant-based program as well. That's, I think, approaching $30 million in terms of funds already inside of it.
Oh.
And it's still figuring out how to dispense it. So I think we are seeing those funds getting larger and more aggressive in terms of how early they're going to make those funds available, which is also key.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'll tie this back a little bit to medical, Ngiste. Vince mentioned the timeline, California going from medical only to medical and adult use. So we're in a similar situation here in New York. What has been the buzz in the medical community? What has this change looked like for you guys over the past year or so?
Well, I think one of the key things here is we actually have a cannabis regulator. And I think one thing that New York did that was really important was that it brought all cannabis regulations under one body. So hemp for human consumption, as well as medical and adult use cannabis, all report to the same regulator, which is better for everybody because there's a lot of symmetry between those three policy areas. I think that we are all, medical operators are going to be included in the MRTA. We're allowed to have 3 retail dispensaries as well as do adult use cultivation. And that's critical both for patients because adult use can help reduce the overall cost for patients to be able to access medicine, none of which is covered by insurance, by reducing the overall cost of just running the business and producing the products. And we're really looking forward to that aspect, in addition to the different ways for us to be supporting new market entrants and social equity applicants. We are the only folks in the state who are not just cultivating cannabis, but cultivate cannabis in accordance with the security and seed to sale tracking requirements that are necessary at this point in time due to federal prohibition for cannabis cultivation. And we've also been advocating for all types of changes, including changes to testing guidelines that, both us and the hemp operators have been struggling to pass because they're the most stringent in the country. And so I think we're moving towards some really important reforms where the progress that's been made on the medical side can start helping laying the groundwork for what needs to be done on the adult use side. Now that said, the medical program has been left under severe neglect for several years, and it's been great to see the movement on cannabis policy in general since with the new leadership and the new office. We have, New York's legalized medical cannabis at the same time as Florida, and there are only roughly 100,000 active patients in New York, and Florida's latest report has 695,000 patients. And so I think that, there was also in the MRTA an expansion to the medical licenses, which I think is vital that gets implemented, especially because there was an emphasis on equity in that expansion as well to ensure that the medical market, again, continues to reflect the population of New York. And then I think as we transition and expand to adult use, we have a role to play. We've seen in the conditional hemp licenses that conditional hemp licensees will have a requirement to mentor and incubate social equity applicants. We look forward to having similar program opportunities to help bring folks in, because as far as we're concerned, the sooner we can get this market up and running, the sooner everybody will be better off. And it's good to see the speed with which things are coming. And I just hope we can continue to create the equitable opportunities and help folks get into the legal market.
It's kind of interesting. I think this shows one of the complexities, right, of this transition to adult use. And we were just talking about how every state does it differently. This is probably one of the most common pieces that we see, is that typically medical operators will get a head start. It's an easy way for operators, licensees that already know the marketplace, they already have an approved license, they know the regulations, their products are already being tested. They're already built out, and it's an easy way to start meeting that demand, as Ning has said, as early as possible. And it kind of seems like common sense, but then you look at it from the flip side as well. And I think there's also, oftentimes there's a lot of concern from newer licensees that are worried about, those incumbents capturing that marketplace, right, and getting all the market share, because it's much harder to displace at that point. And so I think it's another interesting way where New York is trying to thread that needle, where you do get the head start, right, to the existing operators, but at the same time, you're making sure that the smaller businesses still have an opportunity to compete just by that, facility limit that Ning has mentioned as well. So again, it's good.
Oh, I just want to chime in on 2 points too, because head start is language that gets thrown around a lot, but I think it's important to acknowledge a few other things about what's actually happening right now in the status quo. One, we already have thousands of hemp licensees in the state of New York who are also already have established businesses, and that they're already being included in the future of the market. Two, New York has one of the largest and most entrenched legacy markets in the country. Like, cannabis is already here. And I think too frequently when folks talk about market share, we only talk about legal market share. And cannabis is unlike almost any other industry where the vast majority of your competition in any state is unlicensed and very difficult to measure and track. And so I think it's important that we understand that this market is not just about medical operators and head starts. There are lots of folks who are in the cannabis market already, and we're all trying to figure out how to work together for the best possible cannabis market for New York. And to the medical inclusion part, there are two key things. One, medical operators will have to pay a fee that's still to be determined in order to participate in adult use. And two, the tax revenue is supposed to also help fund the different aspects of both the social equity fund and community reinvestment. And so Illinois, for example, has had enduring difficulties in terms of a lot of their social equity licenses at this point being tied up in litigation over the license issuance process. But because they were able to at least start sales, they've already been able to issue, I think, upwards of several $1 million in grants for community reinvestment while they deal with this struggle. And so I think that we're at the beginning of a very long multi-year transition from a fully illegal, unregulated legacy market to a fully regulated market that can operate legally finally at last. And that's going to take many years for that transition to be completed. And everybody, medical, hemp, our legacy operators, and all of the ancillary services like Metrc that will be part of that transition have a role to play in making it a success.
Yeah, I mean, I think to coattail on that, there's a lot that New York or any state has to do to open up a market. I think we generally know the various components: track and trace operators, legacy market, medical operators. But to have all those coalesce at the same time for opening day is really hard. And I think sometimes operators can be quite unforgiving of local governments, of state governments, even when things go wrong and emergency regs have to come out every several months and business operations need to change. I think at the end of the day, it would be healthy to have a view of New York State around the fact that it's also a startup organization as well, similar to all the other operators. There's going to be mistakes that are made. I think California, even today, there's major macro issues in the market. Social equity, obviously we talked about earlier, is still hasn't come to fruition the way the intended effects were supposed to be. There's tons of operators that are on the fringe of going out of business because tax rates are really high. There's overproduction in California, in large part due to the illicit market as well. And so those are things that, maybe we won't have to address day one because there's going to be tons of capital investment in the space and these problems sort of go away. But then as soon as the dust settles, and businesses actually need to prove profitability and, we need to actually show some of the data and results for what we set out to do in the industry. That's when a lot of these problems start to surface. I think it's good to be cognizant of what they might be, even if it's years down the road, and not be so myopic in the beginning.
I completely agree with you, Vince, and I guess your comments as well. And I think that's the part that's so often forgotten, right? Is that states are doing this for the first time ever, right? And honestly, no one gets it right the first time around. And Ning, as you mentioned, allowing for change, right, in the social equity program. I think that applies overall to the program as a whole, and especially with social equity, right? There has to be built-in flexibility. Rules, regulations, laws, they will change. Some things are not going to be perfect. And I think allowing for that patience and that understanding that, again, things will change. It's in an effort to improve the system. But what we have going right now is still better than the status quo. So I completely agree with that sentiment, Vince.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. Nick has talked about the legacy market. Vince, you mentioned it in California too. I think things have changed so much. High school me would be shocked if you said one day you're going to moderate a panel talking about cannabis, right? It's like just that we're having this conversation and we have lots of attendees would have been mind blowing 20, however many years ago, I won't say, but it's an interesting thing because I think there's been a stigma that has changed over time, evolved over time, I would say, not gone away, not fully. But I think all of you have probably played a role in that. But most of all, I would say the medical operators, right? You came into a space that was very new in New York, and as we're hearing in other states too, that people weren't talking about all the time yet. Now you can't drive around in Albany without passing a billboard, right? We're right next to Massachusetts. We all know they're operational over there. It's just cannabis is a word that is thrown around a lot more. I can tell my older relatives, I'm the cannabis practice lead, and it's not like I don't get a weird look, So I'm interested in your thoughts on that, like the stigmatization of cannabis and how that has changed, and particularly with medical coming on in a way that, medicinal, right? So you start the conversation there, and that's a big deal. People tend to look at that first and say, okay, I can get behind that. Some people need it for their pain, or, they can't sleep at night or whatever it is. But now we're looking at something very different. We're talking about opening up the marketplace even further into an area that, as you said, everybody's starting out. We're not getting it right away. Yeah. Things are changing, but the stigma is definitely something that's evolving.
Yeah, I mean, I think the stigma is still definitely there. I grew up on the East Coast, and it was definitely very taboo. I also have, Asian conservative heritage as well. So My parents are still, after 4 years of being in this industry, still not okay fully with me being in this industry. And I think a lot of operators are going to go through that, especially in the new market. It's definitely a little bit better on the West Coast. I think there's a bit more of a open mindset around cannabis. But in New York, I think when the market first opens up, I think it's important to stress the medical benefits of it because of the fact that it's not just a recreational drug, and it's not as harmful to your body as some other substances like alcohol or tobacco. I think cannabis does have it's a unique product that can be used for a lot of health benefits. And so it should be viewed that way. And I think that, as companies start to come online in the new market, the branding of businesses, when you walk into a dispensary, it's actually nice. You're not embarrassed you're not like shielding your face as you're going in, hoping you don't bump into a friend buying weed at a store. Those things will start to change over the next couple of years. I think it's important that the state also helps operators do that educational process too. And so, you mentioned billboards. Still today, that's probably the only way that cannabis businesses can really market. The California state is, I don't want to speak badly about anyone, but there's certain regressions in that as well, where now on federally regulated highways, interstate highways, you can't you can't put up cannabis billboards anymore because it's potentially considered federal jurisdiction. And so, there are more and more limited ways to get the good word around cannabis out there to destigmatize it. Facebook, Google, these large advertising platforms that you would normally build consumer brands on, don't permit cannabis marketing. And so it's a really manual and costly process to do so. And so, my hope is that New York would be open-minded about, allowing businesses to advertise in various different ways, as long as obviously everything is compliant.
I think ending the cannabis stigma has been one of the most interesting things to see over the course of the last few years, just because of, I'm the kind of policy nerd who, I don't know if anybody has ever seen the graphs for when interracial marriage crossed the 50% threshold and when same-sex marriage passed the 50% threshold, and same-sex marriage was much, much steeper. And I'm going to liken that to what happens with cannabis destigmatization, because you already, for a lot of folks, when it came to same-sex marriage, it was finding out that their son or their sister or somebody who they already knew and they already loved had a sexual orientation that they didn't know before. And it's much harder to push somebody away when they're already that close to you. And I think cannabis stigma is very similar, where a lot of folks haven't talked about it for so long, or weren't able to, or didn't feel comfortable, or hid it from their kids, but it was actually the reason why they were able to function as a good parent or to do their jobs. And I think that the more and more we see cannabis be normalized in the public conscious, the more and more we find folks are able to talk about it with each other, the more we start to see the substance be less and less stigmatized. And I think that's vital for everyone. It helps us advocate for resentencing reform and justice reforms to make sure that we stop incarcerating people for something that everyone understands can be responsibly consumed by adults. But it's also things like, for example, in the New York medical market, the average patient is a 55-year-old woman. And I think, for a long time in California, the taxes were so high. My family lives, a few of my siblings and my mom live out there. And, my mom went to the dispensary, and my mom was the one who brought all my siblings into the dispensary. My siblings had, their guys and their informal connections. And I think that the more you start to see folks being able to talk about it, the better off we all are. And for me personally, I had a security clearance for most of my 20s. And wasn't able to consume and didn't have anybody for a supply. My mom was my introduction to cannabis. I was always supportive of it as legalization, but it wasn't until I was in my 30s that my mom took me to her dispensary and I was able to try it. And the relief I had from my insomnia and anxiety was so profound. I got involved with my local chapter of Normal within the next month, because it didn't make sense to me that I could feel so much relief and other people could be incarcerated for the same thing. And so I think this destigmatization is good and it's good progress, but we need to make sure that that progress in the public conscious keeps coming back to inform policy and make sure that we get more and more people out of jail in our states and at the federal level, and start reinvesting and repairing the harm that we've done over the last century plus of prohibition.
Yeah, I'll also add to that by saying, we're talking about medical benefits, and I think a lot of people know that there's obvious ones around, anxiety, seizures, epilepsy, things like that. But what most people understand about cannabis is that there's THC in the product, there's CBD, but actually cannabinoids is like a whole family of chemicals that can be produced organically from cannabis in various strains and genetics. And there's so much research that hasn't been able to be done because of regulation, because it's still a Schedule I substance. It can't be used either recreationally or medically. And so it's really hard to do research on cannabis. And so, allowing more of that activity to get done will create more innovative products, delivery methods, and help continue to destigmatize cannabis in various ways as it becomes a tool for helping out more and more medical conditions beyond just the ones we know today.
I just want to echo what Vince said. Sorry, David, before you speak up. And also, Ed, I highly recommend folks, like, if you're really passionate about and interested, like, definitely look into understanding more about the endocannabinoid system and the other cannabinoids, because everybody focuses on THC and CBD, but there's so much to the plant to understand what would work best for you what type of relief. And then the last point is just that we talk about recreational use, but all the data we see from more mature markets like California and Colorado shows that the so-called recreational user, anywhere from 65 to 75% of them are coming in for a health or wellness reason. And the top 3 reasons, whether you're on the medical side or the adult use side, are pain, insomnia, and anxiety.
Nigis, you read my mind. My analogy is always to your initial point is to same-sex marriage. That's my immediate example, and it's kind of incredible how quickly public sentiment has shifted. And I think you're exactly right. I mean, a lot of it is just exposure, right? It not being taboo anymore, knowing somebody, recognizing, wow, this isn't actually dangerous, and not only that, but this could actually help. And I think you see that mostly with medical markets, right? There's a broader recognition that, this can be done properly, can be done safely, and can help people, right, with their ailments. And then, I think, Vince, to your point too, is you start to see it in the professionalization of the industry, right? And I think that helps with the differentiation from the illicit marketplace too, is walking into a store, right, that looks like an Apple store, and being able to select your products and knowing exactly what's in them. So I'm a patient card holder here in Florida, where I'm based. And that's the biggest reason why I would do it, is I want to know exactly what's in my products. And I think there's also kind of, I don't know if you guys see this or feel this, but I think there's kind of a culture clash in the industry, and not in a bad way, but I think you have a lot of folks who have been in it for a while, the true advocates who have been working in cannabis for decades. And now there's a lot, like I said, professionalization that's coming in, people wearing suits, wearing button downs like me coming in. But I do think there is a shift moving. I think the professionalization is good. I think we should still protect those businesses who are still operating. But Vince, to your point, I think that professionalization actually represents a whole lot of future investment as well. So exactly to your point, Nigis, your point about the cannabinoid system, I'm looking forward to those firms coming in and doing a heck of a lot more research on the efficacy of different products, right? And being able to hyper tailor and target different medications to different ailments. So I think it's actually going to be really fascinating, not just on the adult use side, but what winds up happening in the medical side as well over the coming years. So it's interesting. There's this continuous, like we said before, it's complex. There's a lot of give and take. There's a lot of push and pull. But ultimately, I think that's part of why it's so interesting, right? And it's just going to continue to evolve over time.
Speaking of more evolution in this industry, but also it's a stigma of a different kind, because initially when I said stigma, I'm thinking about people judging, people saying like, oh, that's illegal. The federal overlay is something that we haven't really touched upon, right? And one of the big things, and I keep seeing it come up in the chat and in the Q&A, people are curious, is banking, right? So here in New York State, we have a Department of Financial Services that has said, if you're a state chartered bank, you can take money from the cannabis industry. At the same time, we're talking about a controlled drug at the federal level and this very real problem of finding a bank that is not federally chartered or is in a state that has authorized this. What have you guys seen? You know, Vince, I know we've talked about this before, and I'm sure, Ning, you have a perspective from the medical side too, but it's a very interesting thing and it comes up almost all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big topic that I think deserves a whole nother panel all on its own. But you know, from our experience out in California, each year we process hundreds of millions of dollars of payments, and 2/3 of that still occurs in cash, and it creates a ton of overhead from just an operational cost perspective. It creates security risks for our team and employees. And it just creates, bad business practices as well from an accounting and audit perspective. It's a really hairy issue. And, you know, banking is so needed in this industry from just depository and treasury services perspective, just to be able to put your money somewhere safe and access it quickly. I feel like we operate a business in like the 1800s right now, just because it's almost like, I feel like you can't really start a business without a bank account, but yet so many people do in cannabis. And I think, one is just not to diverge too far, but I think it just shows how eager people are looking to get into the industry and help out. And, there's that much consumer demand that people are willing to go through great lengths to start a business in cannabis. Even beyond that, I think the second part is the capital that comes into the space. Normal small businesses can get working capital loans from banks at decent rates. In cannabis, a lot of operators who have really good intentions about starting a business in the industry and selling a product or service can't get proper financing and to start their business. And so they're left to work with sometimes, hard bargainers on the private lending side to help them start their business. And I've seen a lot of operators, some of whom are my friends, and they lose control of their business over time because they are succumbed to, pretty bad terms when they negotiate with private lenders who are looking to, find healthy yields and premiums in the cannabis space because they know that operators like us don't have other options. And so that's, I think those are the two main things. One is just, safety security component. And then the next is helping a business grow sustainably from like a financial perspective and a working capital perspective.
It's a good example, I think, of what we see overall in the industry, right? Because it is still federally scheduled. You have a cottage industry springing up in cannabis to provide all sorts of services that typically larger companies will provide, but are just hesitant to get into for cannabis. And I think we saw that a lot with security, like Vince had mentioned, different software companies as well, payments, and we see that with banking, which is a hugely critical issue. For all of the reasons that Vince outlined, and I think it's tough, right? I mean, banks are still regulated. They still have FinCEN requirements that they have to meet. They're obligated to make sure that the deposits made in their institution are legally gained. And that's tough to do in a very new industry, especially in a very risk-averse institution. So they're put in a tough position. And I think that's why you see a lot more local players, right? So state credit unions, state banks coming into the play and trying to support these businesses. But it's also still cost intensive from their end, right? Again, entirely new industry, entirely new data sets, new compliance teams that you've got to onboard and start sifting through this self-reported data. So, what we're seeing as well is there's a cottage industry within the cottage industry of different, not just payment service providers, but intermediaries that'll help banks make sense of that data. And, we're proud in a couple of states to work with those banks and those integrators as well. Luckily, a lot of the information that licensees put into a track and trace system is that final sales data, and it's the source of truth for the state. So that means it's very easy for it to become the source of truth to the banks as well. So it makes their job a lot easier because they can say, well, you made $1 million in revenue, but you have a deposit of $10 million. Something's a little off here, versus actually aligning those deposits. So it's still an incredibly tough issue. I think what's kind of fascinating is the different solutions that are popping up to help make that connection viable.
Yeah, I'll share a quick anecdote. I remember one of the times it got really tough operating in the space without a bank was actually during COVID when it first hit. Cannabis, first of all, was not allowed to apply for SBA loans back then when they were giving these really low interest rate loans to help jolt the economy. And not to mention that, but obviously the cannabis industry lobbied to really help or to basically get people their medicine. So, cannabis was deemed essential during that time as well. And obviously as an operator, it's a great thing because you can keep your business running. You can help out your patients. But then at the same time, if you don't get the financial support, but you're still essential, you're kind of like forced to operate in a very hazardous environment. And cash is dirty too. It's a physical thing. And to process that much cash, there was during the pandemic, we had COVID scares all the time during when COVID first hit, and a lot of it was because of payments. And so around that time, there's actually an operator, a bank now that is widely known in cannabis called East West Bank. They do other banking services as well, but they've helped us. They helped us, and we were one of the first businesses to onboard onto their system, and they help with processing cash and everything. And so now with the hundreds of brands and thousands of retailers that we work with, they can process payments in cash through us, and it's actually a major value proposition that we offer to the industry, and helps out a lot of the small operators who don't have the financial wherewithal to actually get a license or to get a business bank account at one of these larger institutions. And so that was just a short story around how tough banking can be and make for an operator.
And I think some states actually stepped in because of that, Vince. I completely agree with you. There was that weird, you're essential, but at the same time, you can't get funding support right from the federal government. But I think Massachusetts stepped in. I think it was Massachusetts. They had a fund set up to provide that emergency relief. So it's, it goes back to the crux of the issue, right? I think on the federal level, things are moving super slowly, and so states are just trying to fill the gap however they can.
Yeah. And I think on that, it's important for New Yorkers, since we are in New York, city and state New York, to recognize that one of the primary sponsors for federal legalization on the Senate side is your very own Senator Schumer. And I think that there's a lot about banking that would help many things. I also think we should acknowledge that there's not a lot about banking that's been super great for non-white men in general accessing capital. And I hope that we can push for a safe banking with some critical amendments to it to help improve access to capital, especially for social equity licensees and folks coming through these state programs. But we have options right now at the federal level to have normal banking regulations and to reduce some of these banking challenges. And we need folks to remind your New York Senator Schumer to support those in addition to the overall comprehensive cannabis reform.
Yeah, I'm really glad the regulators are thinking about it. It's a major infrastructural piece that will help the system be stable. And I'll also mention, I think even with bank accounts, it hurts from also an investment perspective too. So, as a business, we obviously raise money from external creditors or venture capitalists and investors. But we don't have access to the larger institutional funds because they raise money from, school endowments or unions or, institutional funds that currently don't want to invest into federally illegal industries. And so, the amount of capital that can come into the space also is limited because of banking issues. And there's been times when we've gone out to raise money, and investors who eagerly want to invest money, they can't even set up a bank account to invest their money. And so it really limits the amount of resources that can be poured forth into building a sustainable supply chain and ecosystem for the safe transaction of cannabis products into the retail market.
I would be remiss if I didn't bring this one piece up. In New York with adult use, we had the opt-out for municipalities just on the dispensary or on-site consumption side, but we've seen over 50% of the municipalities in New York take the chance of opting out, right? And a lot of people are saying, why would they do that? What's, but I think we're talking about why, right? We're talking about the different stigmatization that's still there, the hesitancies, the question marks. And I think we've largely heard too from many of these municipalities that they don't know yet what the regulatory structure is going to look like and what it's actually going to mean for a municipality to have a benefit from this industry. But I think we've talked about so many things and the evolution, right? Coming along from, okay, medical's coming to New York or whichever state we're talking about and slow steps, right? And getting there and getting to a more neutral place with cannabis and now being at the cusp of even a broader acceptance of this, we hope, right? What do you think might need to change to get some of these municipalities on board? Do you think there are safety aspects to it? Do you think it's thinking about the kids? Like what do you think is going through the minds of these folks when they're making the decision not to get involved?
So we had to go through the opt-out process in New York. We were very fortunate that it was Riverhead was the most contentious process in terms of actually bringing it to a vote, and it did go. They did end up opting in. And I think that's one area where having an existing medical footprint helps folks, because you can just keep pointing to what the realities are for a regulated cannabis industry. You can't get into our facility if you are under the age of 18. Like you have to show an ID. So when folks are worried about kids, like we can easily point to the fact that like we know this because we have had people under 18 try to set foot in our dispensary and they get turned away at the door. I don't know that I would have tried to make that ploy with my high school student ID, which is definitely a story that was once attempted and thwarted, right? And that's the point of that, is it was successful in keeping cannabis out of the hands of somebody who was not old enough to be purchasing it without the consent and advice of a doctor or medical professional and their supervising guardians. I think that the conversation for us that happened there and what ultimately decided it was we had folks, including former law enforcement, who were like, cannabis is here. Like it's already in the community. That's not what I'm worried about. What I'm worried about is if we opt in, then we can regulate it. We can make rules about time, place, manner. And if we don't opt in, we don't have any control over how cannabis is showing up in our community. And I think that a lot of places opted out because they wanted to know more and see more. And the good news is once you opt out, you can opt back in. But once you opt in, you can't opt out, which is also important for businesses that choose to invest in a community to know that they'll be able to continue their operations. I think that the more folks start to see it coming to their communities and realizing that it's not the bogeyman that they might think it is or have been told it is, it makes it easier and easier for communities to opt in. But I also think it's important, and this was, I think, vital in the New York process, and we're seeing this happen in more and more states where in order to opt out, it's not just a town council vote, you have to put it to a referendum. And that's important because we can't have these opt-out decisions be made by 5 people on a town council meeting with 2 weeks notice. It needs to be a process with public input and with citizens getting to have a say in how opt-out will affect them. And I think if we can keep seeing that, it's important that localities have choice in this matter. And if, I think all of us as businesses would like to go to a community that is happy to have us there and wants us to be there. And more communities are realizing that cannabis brings jobs and not just any jobs, but jobs with like living wages and benefits, that cannabis brings tax revenue, which goes back to the community and gives them opportunity to build out more infrastructure and to provide more services. And that the reality is it's already here. And so are you going to have it show up in your community in a way that's going to help you build the community you want to have in your town or county? Or are you going to force it to persist in the shadows? Or frankly, through delivery options, which will ensure that the tax revenue goes to whatever location decided to host a dispensary and not yours, because everybody in your town is going to be buying and consuming cannabis. It's up to you whether your town gets a benefit from it or not.
Yeah, you go for it, Urban.
No, you go.
Okay. Yeah, no, I was going to echo what Ngiste had to say around the opting out and opting in. I think municipalities, I totally get it why they opt out, because they want to wait and see pretty much. And it's a one-way street. Once you opt in, you can't come back out. In California, there's about, when they first issued out licenses, it was about 800 to 900 licenses, similar to, I think, what New York is expecting to issue out on the retail side in the beginning. And now right now the state's at about 1,300 to 1,400 licenses on retail. But if you look at like a heat map of municipalities and where dispensaries are, there's only about 65% of California municipalities that have cannabis activity. So, a lot of cities are cannabis deserts, and there's tons of people that need retail access, and they're just ultimately going to go to the illicit market to buy products the same way they've always had. And the city just won't benefit from having jobs. They won't benefit from the tax revenues. And ultimately, buying off the illicit market is not is a channel, but it's also an unsafe channel as well. I think, and it's sad because I think sometimes what tips people over, or local governments over, into supporting cannabis is these sort of really, really nasty events. For instance, back in late 2019, there was the whole Vapegate crisis. And that's what tips a lot of people over into, consumers rather, over into purchasing through legal channels. And that's what creates a lot of demand for more municipalities, for more operators to open up legal channels for selling cannabis products. But it is sometimes, those really nasty events in history that create these tipping points for more legal consumption, and they're willing to pay an extra few bucks to save a lung. So I think hopefully we don't have to go there, but I think municipalities also should consider the timing of which they opt in as well, because otherwise the rest of the cannabis businesses are going to start to set up shop in these other municipalities who got to the plate first. A lot of those will be ultimately the larger businesses down the road in cannabis as well.
I completely agree, Vince. And I think, it's nothing new, right? I mean, you've got dry towns, dry counties, right? This is a similar flavor of that. And it's up to the voters, right, to make that decision. And by extension, the city council kind of commissioners, et cetera. I do think, it's going to be a lot of exposure. I completely agree. It's going to be a lot of, sitting and waiting and seeing how things pan out. Ultimately, I agree with you. I think it's a matter of educating folks, right? So telling them more about the safeguards that are put in place, right? So, Ning, as you mentioned, the safeguards just from preventing underage folks from entering stores, right? There's also the product safety requirements, packaging requirements, track and trace requirements, that every single plant, every single product is traced and can be reviewed by the regulators. So I think it's incumbent on us to tell that story and to explain the safeguards. And then, Vince, I mean, ultimately, I completely agree with your other point too. It's the best argument as well, which is that a legal marketplace inherently will siphon away from the illegal marketplace, right? That's the goal, the entire goal that all of us are after. And when you do that, you create a safer marketplace, right? You have less illicit activities, you have safer products, you have better public safety. So I do think, the more we can educate, the more we can inform, the more we can help affect that.
So I have one final question. I know we're getting closer to time, but this one's a little lighter. I think we talked about so many different things that are happening, but what do you think will happen if we did this same panel again in 2025 or 2026? What do you think we'd be talking about? Or what do you hope we would be talking about? Might be a better way to answer it or ask it.
I hope we're up here with a whole bunch of wildly successful social equity licensees talking about how wonderful and how New York was the model for social equity licensing, and how we're reinvesting and repairing the harms, in addition to what Vince alluded to in terms of being able to talk about the new research that's coming up, because we finally ended federal prohibition in the first rounds of studies that are going deeper into the benefits of cannabis would be starting to come to fruition at that point. And so I hope that basically every single thing that we've had to talk about on this panel is like just such old news. It doesn't even have to be raised, because we're just talking about all of the exciting new stuff that's happening because of where we are in cannabis. I suspect it won't be quite that smooth sailing, because nothing ever is in this space. But but I hope that we're still talking about the solutions that are being tried and new solutions and new problems at the very least. I would love for us to be able to solve some of the existing problems and move on to new areas and new challenges for the future of cannabis.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm definitely in the same boat around hoping to talk about a lot of new products that come out, probably products that have been commercialized at that point that we haven't even fathomed yet today because of research that's being done today. And beyond that, I think it's about, beyond just consumer choice, but also access. So I'd love to be talking about, I think this might be too short for 3 to 5 years, but some form of global commerce where, you can import, export to other countries like Canada, who's also federally legal. But yeah, ultimately, I hope that the US is already federally legal by that point. And we can talk about these, larger scale operational issues that need to be solved at that point, less so state by state issues or municipality by municipality issues for that matter.
Vince, you read my mind. I think I had two pieces. One was the continued normalization, right, where the legal marketplace fully captures the illicit marketplace, and as we can crowd that out. And then I think to Ngiste, your point, focusing on the bigger issues, right? I do think federal legalization is going to be super interesting to watch. I don't view it happening in the near term. I do think 3 to 5 years is probably more when it's going to be likely. And then I think to that end, Vince, international trade is going to be huge, but also interstate trade. I think that's going to be hugely disruptive to the industry, right? Because now all of a sudden, instead of these localized economies, these statewide economies that are set up and fully insulated, interstate trade means that you're going to have businesses picking up shop and moving elsewhere or consolidating. With that as well, I think you have the entry of bigger players like pharmaceuticals to do exactly that research, to do the manufacturing as well. So I'm hopeful that those are the big issues that we're talking about, and we're able to, just like we were saying before, not only the social equity licensees, but the small businesses as well. What are we doing to make sure that those folks can still compete?
It's awesome. I think we could probably do a whole other hour, but I really thank you guys all so much. And Jonathan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Emily. Thanks to all of you for this fantastic discussion. I'd like to thank Brown and Weinraub, Metrc, the New York Medical Cannabis Industry Association, and Nabis for sponsoring this event. Quickly, like a couple upcoming city and state events on Tuesday, March 29th at 8 a.m. Our sister organization, NYN Media, is doing their annual BoardCon event in person at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. You can get tickets on the website. We'll share that link in the chat. Also, on Wednesday, April 20th at 9 a.m., we have our annual Healthy New York Summit back here in person, also at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. Tickets are on sale now and can be found in our website in the chat. Finally, thank you, Emily, for moderating. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to our audience. This concludes our program.